Sequart organization. I'm the webmaster and general book line manager for Sequart organization. Um, I'm here with Thomas McLean and Dr. Julian Darius to discuss Thomas McLean's book Mutant Cinema. If you're joining us here today, it's because you're a part of our Patreon book club for our exclusive members. It's a pleasure to having you guys here today, and hopefully we can all get some good answers and get some good information on Thomas McLean's book. And I'm just going to pass it off to Julian and Tom, and we'll have a fun roundtable at the end. About 45 minutes in the Hangout, we'll take some time to ask some questions, and if you guys have any questions for us, you can pitch us your questions and just submit it through the question answer app within this Google Hangout setup, and we'll get on with that. So, anyways, Julian and Tom, it's a pleasure having you guys with us today, and let's see what we have about Mutant Cinema.
Well, so we're talking about Mutant Cinema, the X-Men trilogy from comics to screen, with the author Tom McLean.
I'm not hearing anything right now.
Oh, are you not hearing anything? Can you hear me?
I'm not hearing Julian right now.
Are you hearing me, Stuart?
I can hear you.
Okay.
Let me go into here. Oh, all right. Wait a second. There you go. Talk now.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me now?
I can hear you now. There you
right.
go. Hi.
Hey.
Okay. All right.
Okay, so
cool.
well, why don't we start by just talking about your love of the X-Men, because I know that you are a lifelong X-Men fan, and in fact, we sent some people to your house to film some of your comics because you have such a great collection.
Exactly. Well, we filmed right in this room. Right, I was sitting right over here. Yeah. Well, let's see. I sort of got into comics. I always liked superheroes. I always liked animated versions of them were the first ones I encountered when I was a kid. I read comic books as a little kid. Superheroes kind of got replaced by science fiction when I got into Star Trek, and this movie called Star Wars came along that you might have heard of. And the old Marvel Star Wars comic was the first comic that I really collected and got really into, and was going to the drugstore every 3 or 4 weeks looking for the new issue, sort of thing. And then I got out of comics for a while, like a lot of people do, and when I got back into it, it was again through Star Wars. I was interested in Star Wars, and I started collecting the Marvel comic again when I was in my mid-teens. And right about that time, it was switching over to bi-monthly and just about to end, just as I was getting into it. And I was like, well, I like comics too much to just kind of stop doing this. So I started buying some other Marvel stuff, and started seeing the X-Men in various books that I had picked up, and finally took the plunge. And I think the first issues I bought were numbers 202, 203, and annual number 9, the last part of the Asgardian Wars. So this would have been 1985, and I was about 15 or 16 at that time. And it just impressed me as different from everything else that I'd been reading in comic books. It just had a certain quality to it, a seriousness, I guess, a depth to it. The characters had fascinating relationships, and I was immediately hooked, and it immediately became my favorite, and I just started collecting from there, and ended up with a very large collection. It became my favorite.
And you went back and you bought, this was before trade paperbacks, of course. You bought all the issues before you came on with Asgardian Wars?
Yeah, that was back then. They didn't have. Well, they had one paid trade paperback, which I did buy. That was the first version of the Dark Phoenix one, which I still have. It's one of my favorites. But yeah, I mean, I just started buying back issues. When I got a summer job, I was living in Phoenix, and I would go over to All About Books and Comics, which is still a great comic shop over there, and twice a week I'd go over there and buy the next 4 or 5 issues that I needed out of the back issue bin until I was all the way back to the ones that were starting to become expensive. And then years later, eBay sort of came along and made it easier to buy the some of the more expensive ones and fill in the gaps. And I'm down to about, I don't know, 12 or so issues that I need, and I slowly but surely fill them in. I don't have as much time or money to devote to that because I now have got a full-time job. I got a 4-year-old and another one on the way. So.
Well, congratulations.
Very busy. Thank you.
Was when you were reading the X-Men comics, was an X-Men movie like a pie-in-the-sky dream to you? Did you ever think we'd be talking about a right now 7-movie deep franchise with
No.
4 more on the way?
Of comics in general was that it gave kind of a depth and quantity of this type of material that nothing else delivered. I loved all of the movies and things that were coming out. You had every couple of years you'd have a Star Trek movie, you'd have Aliens or a Terminator movie or something like that, maybe 1 or 2 a year. But if you love this stuff, it's not enough. And especially when you're a teenager and you're really passionate about this sort of thing. So comics, just by the sheer quantity of them, they were cheap back then. They were still inexpensive. It was very easy to just sort of immerse yourself in these worlds, and they were complicated and deep and interesting, and there was always a new corner to explore or place to go, and that was what set comics apart for me. It gave me that which at the time nothing else really did. And even for a long time, when I started tracking the development of the movies and stuff, you look at the early attempts at making an X-Men movie, and they were always sort of trying to start off the way the comics started off, with the small group of characters, and maybe by the end we'll introduce Wolverine, and you sort of had this sense that, well, they have to make 2 or 3 good movies before they can build it up enough to where we can get enough characters in it and enough complexity in it for it to really be sort of like the comics that I really like to see. So it was really it was very much a surprise when the first movie came along and actually was able to kind of pull off some of this and was successful in doing so, and successful commercially to sort of point the way for everything that has come since.
Well, that leads me to my next question, which is that really the X-Men movies, along with Spider-Man, launched the era we're now in, not only in terms of superhero movies, but also the total dominance of Hollywood tentpole movies by superhero flicks. And so, I mean, do you think that the early X-Men films get enough credit for that?
Probably not. I think when you look back, especially at the first one now, it looks a little clunky, and it's a little bit hard to understand how revolutionary it was at the time. When the first movie came out, I think that that the standard Hollywood marketing didn't show that a lot of people knew who the X-Men were. A lot of people weren't really interested in it, but over the years, so many people had read the comic book at one point or another, or seen the animated show, which was really important for X-Men. That it was a huge surprise when it came out. I remember I was working at Variety at the time, and they were tracking maybe a $30 to $35 million opening weekend for it, and it hit 54.
Yeah.
And blew out, and I mean everybody was completely stunned by how well that movie did, and it did sort of point the way, and it took like about 4 or 5 years before you had enough comic book movie successes, the X-Men ones being first, but then Spider-Man came along and was also a huge hit. Before you really sort of got into the wave that we're in now, where you've got Marvel Studios making 10 movies, you've got DC making 10 movies, you've got Fox doing Fantastic Four and X-Men, you've got Sony doing Spider-Man, and you've got all of these TV shows, a lot good.
Yeah, it's been a long road. And I
Yeah.
seem to remember that when the first X-Men movie came out, I mean, it was such a different era. I remember fans complaining about the casting of Wolverine. He wasn't
Mhm.
short enough. The outfits were leather and the sort of movie version. They weren't the classic outfits. And I remember there being a lot of sort of fan trepidation and complaint going into that first film.
Well, and it was probably warranted given what Marvel had done up to that point.
Hmm.
I don't know if anyone remembers, around, only a couple of years before X-Men, there was that Nick Fury, Agent of Shield TV movie with David Hasselhoff, um,
Yeah.
a real gem. Um, but yeah, I mean, there have been so many promises over the years that Marvel was going to start making movies of all of these characters, and Howard the Duck comes and flops, and Captain America and the Punisher, and the sort of new and that Fantastic Four movie. There wasn't really a sense that Marvel could do anything with it. Anything could really be that no one had figured out how to do it. DC at least had a little bit of success with Superman and Batman, but Marvel was considered back then way behind the curve,
Hmm.
and the fact that that first X-Men came out, and even though it is a little bit clunky and it is a little bit, it was made on the cheap. It was not they didn't invest a lot of money. The studio didn't have a ton of faith in it. I think the budget was only $75 million when most movies of that type were in the 125 range.
Hmm.
And it was really Bryan Singer and David Hayter and the people who worked on that movie really believing in it that made it work. Yeah, I think it's easy to sort of forget, and it's easy for people to look back and think, well, now that we have Avengers: Age of Ultron and things like that, it doesn't quite. It's of its time, It's of its, it doesn't really. It's not a modern film anymore. It's 15 years old, which is crazy.
Yeah, it is crazy, and it's crazy to think that there are kids who are nearing high school graduation who were born when that came out, and
Oh
they're
yeah,
still making movies in more or less in that continuity. Um,
yeah.
so maybe you could talk about how the book got started, how we got connected, and the book came together.
I had just left Variety at the end of 2005 and started freelance writing. And while I was a little bit of background, I was a comic fan going way back, obviously. And when I was at Variety, I was started to grow. And I was one of the few people on staff at Variety who sort of knew anything about comic books, which turned out to be very advantageous. Um, 2000 and 2001, going to the editors and saying, I'm going to Comic what go down a Comic Con, I'd write a story and file it, and I started to get some big names in the story. Angelina Jolie shows up, James Cameron shows up, Ang Lee shows up, Bryan Singer shows up, and all of a sudden, a couple of years later, it was completely taking off. So I was doing a lot of that stuff for Variety, and I did a blog for them called Bags and Boards, which was
Hmm.
started it with a friend of mine who now works at the LA Times on Hero Complex, but he and I started it, and he only stayed with it about a month or so before he left, and then I just took it over, and I just wrote a lot about comics and the comics business on there, with the idea being that with comic books being at that point still kind of new to Hollywood, I would sort of keep my finger on the pulse and be a place that the Variety readers could go to and see what's going on in comic books, whether it's Marvel or DC or the independent stuff. And through that, I got to do I got to meet a lot of people in the comic book business. I got to be an Eisner Awards judge. Um, I made a lot of friends and talked to a lot of people. And when I left Variety, I went to the New York Comic Con, and I think it was the first one actually.
Hmm.
And you guys had a booth there. And on Sunday, I was walking around, maybe slightly hungover, and came across your booth and I saw your Batman Begins book, and I started flipping through it, and I thought, this is really kind of a cool idea. And so I started talking, and I think I asked you guys, are you guys going to do an X-Men one? Because it was early 2006, and The Last Stand was coming out that summer. And you guys were like, well, we don't, we're more DC guys. We don't really know as much about Marvel or the X-Men. And well, I do. And it was about that simple. And so a few weeks later, we had an agreement, and I started writing the book. And I'd never really written a book before, so it was a big learning process for me. But it was a lot of fun. I still have I think I burned through the DVDs that I had at the time of all the movies, and it was enjoyable. It was fun to go back and go through all of the comic books as well, and pretend that this was work, and and yeah, it was fun, and eventually we got the book done, and Kevin did a great cover for it, and the people who've read it have told me they really enjoy it. So it's been rewarding in that way.
Yeah, well, I'm glad to hear that, and I think that it's a fantastic book that does such a phenomenal job of looking at. You were talking about the early attempts to film X-Men and the importance of the animated series, and that's all in there. Only you could have really put all this stuff together, and also does such a great job of looking at all the different storylines, all the different versions of the X-Men, and how the movies inevitably kind of draw from this kind of collage of different stories to put together this trilogy. Maybe you could talk about how successful you think that original trilogy in retrospect did that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think the first one is sort of by nature and story, as they all are. But luckily, with the premise of X-Men and the mutants, you don't have to sort of bog things down with a lengthy coming of age story so much, as explain sort of who these people are, and who are the X-Men, who's Magneto's side. They kept that part of it fairly simple. That one drew probably the least on any sort of specific comic book storylines, although there's a lot of similarities to, Neil Adams says that they borrowed his there's excuse me, where I think it was most successful was where I think it was most successful was with the characters. They really managed to get the characters on screen intact with their personalities. Maybe not all of the. Maybe they didn't act as. Excuse me, I have a bit of a cold. Maybe the action wasn't as he would expect for a comic book movie. Maybe it wasn't as didn't have as wide a scope as a good X-Men comic book story does. But the characters were. And I think that has a lot to do with it. I think it has a lot to do with the success of X-Men. I actually once, at Comic-Con, shared a pedicab over to the convention with a guy who worked on the animated series, and he wrote all the character descriptions. And he told me that the last thing he wrote very long character descriptions for all of the characters. The very last thing he put in was their powers.
Mm-hmm.
So it was all their personalities and their conflicts and their histories, and then at the very end, their powers. And I think that's one of the real strengths of the X-Men as a comic book and as a movie series. They managed to get that over there. The second one obviously mines specific comic book storylines in a lot more detail. And I know David Hayter was specifically, he was writing it as X-Men God Loves Man Kills was as the title before he moved off of it and the other writers came in and sort of finished it. I think it's very successful with the Weapon X stuff, with the God Loves Man Kills stuff. The Phoenix stuff doesn't really. It seems very tacked on to me, and I still don't quite. If you read the book, I still don't quite understand the ending, and you know why Jean had to sacrifice herself in that way, because it doesn't make a lot of sense if you think about it.
Right.
But you know, it again, it had all the characters there, and it was, you know, that was one where an instance where, you know, the first movie was smaller. They were able to really expand on the second one as far as the action. You know, the sequence where Wolverine takes on all the guards in the mansion is pretty great. That was sort of something that, you know, I think fans have to see someone pull off, and they did a really good job. Third one, which is always the controversial one. I think that, you know, I think the mutant cure part was the more successful part of it, but it still wasn't as successful as it could have been, because it still gets muddled. It still, you know, you still come down asking questions. Why are they, you know, why are they protesting this? Who's protesting this? Why is, you know, this a problem? And there were a lot of things that weren't very clear on that. And then the Phoenix plot was just, it was clear that they just dropped it halfway through the movie. I mean, you know, it was kind of interesting up until, you know, Professor Xavier gets disintegrated, and then from that point on, they just sort of forgot about it until the end, where it's like, oh yeah, we got to have her die, bring her back in, and we'll have Wolverine kill her. So,
yes,
you know,
spoilers, right?
Yeah. Is it really a spoiler in any X-Men story that Jean Grey dies? I don't think so.
How many times has she died in the comics? Yeah.
Well, actually, Phoenix, the Phoenix, which was not Jean Grey, died the first time, and then Jean died, and then Grant Morrison killed her for good.
Well,
she's stayed dead since then, I think. Yeah.
Well, I mean, she dies, and then they rediscover that under the John Byrne stuff, right? That it was only the Phoenix part that died, right?
Right. Yeah, that was a nice little two-step dance out of that one. A regrettable one. I wish they hadn't done it, but
yeah. Well, speaking of The Last Stand, I mean, do you think it's really as bad as they say? And what do you think about the shift of kind of to Wolverine instead of Cyclops? I know you talk about that in your book.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that happened in the comics. You go back to the early run of the X-Men, and Cyclops was the driving force, and Wolverine was kind of the side character. And you know, it just became very clear over time that in Wolverine and Storm, and you know, to the point where he's marrying off Scott and writing him out of the book, and Wolverine essentially takes over. And you know, that's you know, you look at the history of Marvel since then, and you know, Wolverine is incredibly successful for them. So it makes sense that they would want to shift as much to Wolverine, because it seems that to people who, you know, come into it after the fact, he's the character people like. He's the character people identify with. So you know, it makes sense. But for that particular story, it was about Scott and Jean, and to change that to, you know, Jean and Logan, successful. You know, the real problem with the Dark Phoenix story, as it appears in the comic book, is I think you'd need like 2 or 3 movies to do it properly, because it's, you know, it's one of those things where, you know, in the comic it built up over 40 issues basically before it exploded, and that was a lot of the thrill of it, was, you know, the way it very slowly developed and then went in this unexpected direction where she killed herself, especially at the time when, you know, the characters didn't really die, especially, you know, leading characters in one of the cornerstone Marvel books. Uh, I don't think The Last Stand is as bad as most people say it is. I think there's a couple things going on there. One, I think there's a reaction to Brett Ratner. I
Hmm.
think people just don't like Brett Ratner as much as they like Bryan Singer. But at the same time, I also don't think that much of anything about that movie can be blamed on Brett Ratner, because I know he was hired onto the movie, I think, 2 weeks before it had to start shooting.
Yeah.
Um, so in a lot of ways, I think if they hadn't gotten Brett Ratner, I'm not sure who they could have gotten who could have done a better job. I think it's highly likely they would have ended up with some kind of newcomer director who would have been thrown into an incredibly movie could have been a lot worse than it was, because at least Brett Ratner had experience directing A-list movies, and most of the problems with the movie were caused by the studio. There were decisions made by the studio, and not necessarily the writers even. Simon Kinberg and Zach Penn say they wrote every word on that movie, which um, I think they were dedicated to it. They were doing their best. I think Brett Ratner was doing his best, but the studio threw everybody in there in an almost impossible situation. And I remember at the time talking to people who worked on it, and they were like, "Well, this movie was made in exactly 1 year. We started in April of 2005, and we ended in April of 2006." And they were doing visual effects and building like the model of the bridge before they even had a script. And it was an impossible amount of work that they somehow managed to pull off in a year, because the studio simply wanted to get the movie out before Superman Returns.
Yeah.
So a lot of they also sort of lost their nerve on the Phoenix storyline. They were the ones who sort of didn't let it go the way that it, in a way that would have been, I think, more satisfying. So for all of that, I think it gets a little bit of a bad rap. I think it could have been a lot worse. I think if you compare it more objectively to the first film, which was Bryan Singer, and he had some class, but it's still a little bit clunky in a lot of places. I don't think it's as bad as people say it is. There's a lot of things I like about it, including the fact that some action, and we got to see the characters kind of unleashed a little bit.
Yeah.
Because Bryan Singer he did fantastic on the character stuff, and he always kind of held back on the action a little bit, which was good, because you were always it left you wanting more, but you also never quite got the satisfaction of seeing everything that these characters might be able to do in a movie, and I think we got some of that in The Last Stand.
Yeah, I agree with you. What do you think of the speculation that now that they've sort of soft rebooted the continuity with Days of Future Past, that they might end up doing a better Dark Phoenix saga?
Well, that would be great. They could do that. I would sort of advise them to maybe think twice about it, having seen what happened with the Amazing Spider-Man,
Mm-hmm.
where they went back and redid the origin story, less than 10 years story, and it longer to tell the story in the Amazing Spider-Man than they did in the original, in the Sam Raimi version, and it slowed everything down. Um, I think before I would hope that in try and do that again, they would tap into some of the other storylines that are out there. And I think they're going to do Apocalypse next. I think that'll be interesting to see.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's a lot of other things that they can do before they can maybe go back and try that again. So we'll see.
Well, what do you think of the 4 movies subsequent to the original trilogy? I assume you're not a big fan of X-Men Origins Wolverine.
No, I think haven't even I saw it in the theaters and I haven't seen it since, even though I own a copy of it somewhere here. And for me, a lot of it was just even that era of the comics that they were pulling everything from, which was that early '90s phase where whatever Wolverine thought he knew about his life only lasted for 3 issues or so before that was all revealed to be fake, and all of the covert ops stuff with Sabretooth and Silver Fox and things like that. None of that was ever my stuff that I really liked in the Wolverine book, and making a movie out of it was a mistake. But also that was a really troubled production. I know that they had a lot of problems making that movie. They didn't have a terribly good script. I know that I heard rumors that Richard Donner himself actually had to go out and help direct some of it because there were so many problems with the movie. Not my favorite. It's sort of the easiest one to ignore and pass over for me. I like X-Men First Class a lot. That was an inventive and inventive reboot, I think. I really liked the idea of placing it in a specific time and place of the '60s. I love that they tied it into the Cuban Missile Crisis. I like that they put in a lot of new characters that we hadn't really seen before, like Banshee and Havoc and all of these other characters that were kind of fun. And they sort of continued the tradition that Bryan Singer said of just getting a really great cast for these movies. McAvoy and Fassbender are fantastic. So that was that movie still had a little bit of an origin story feel to it that I think slowed it down a little bit because you had a lot of training sequences, and it's whenever those pop up, I think of the. Was it South Park or Team America where they had the montage?
Right.
Song,
I think it's Team America, right? You need a montage.
Yeah, we need a montage. always fade out in a montage.
Yeah.
There was a lot of that. So I think and the Wolverine I enjoyed a lot. It was sort of nice to see some of that particular story done, although the ending was just kind of a.
Yeah.
But it was good. It was good up to that point.
Sort of superhero movie, right? I mean, it's such a. It seems to me it's such an art movie, of course, based on the Claremont miniseries. But it really comes off as a very low-key movie in contrast to the flamboyance of sort of Magneto and stuff like that. But it does go south in its kind of conventional ending. Is that your impression?
Yeah, I enjoyed it. I enjoyed a lot of it right up until the ending. The ending just got kind of strange and a little generic for a comic book movie. But the character stuff with Logan and Mariko and all of that stuff leading up to it, and Wolverine in Japan, that was all pretty good stuff that you don't see in a lot of superhero movies. And it was nice to see something like like that. That's as much of a direct adaptation of one of the X-Men comic books as we're likely to get from one of these movies. And then Days of Future Past. I rewatched Days of Future Past last night. I actually think it might be the best of the bunch. Very very sharp, great characters all around, great cast, good action. I really enjoyed it and enjoyed sort of the way that they played with all of the different aspects of that storyline. I think it was a good idea. I think it's a little bit easier to adapt shorter stories. The original Days of Future Past is only 2 issues.
Right.
I think it's easier for a movie to take something like that and expand it, rather than try and take something like the Phoenix Saga, 10 issues or 40 issues, and try and compress it. Because then they can find things that just work better for a movie. And the performances were good, the direction was good, the ending was satisfying. I think it was the best one.
Yeah, it's interesting that it does sort of the same substitute Wolverine maneuver that Last Stand does, of having him be the one who goes into the past as opposed to going to the future.
Yeah. They do have a decent plot point for that, but I mean, as much as I like Ellen Page and Kitty Pryde, I don't know that using Kitty as the focus would have was going to fly at
Right.
Fox or with moviegoers. I was like, well, why isn't Wolverine in here? Um,
So were you psyched when they announced that Bryan Singer was coming back and not only doing Days of Future Past, but now doing Apocalypse?
I wasn't at first, but having seen Days of Future Past, I'm looking forward more to Apocalypse. He certainly has
Mm-hmm.
a good touch to it, and he's grown as a filmmaker. I think his stuff is better on the X-Men now than it was back then. So I think as someone who gets it and has some skill at this sort of thing, he's as great a choice as we're going to get. So hopefully he'll do a couple more
Yeah.
before they pass it off, because when we've seen when other people try and do it, it doesn't quite seem to work as well. So stick around, Brian.
Well, I want to return to the point you made about character, specifically sort of vis-a-vis the early X-Men films, and how that was such a strength. I want to sort of circle back to Claremont because
Right.
it seems to me that's such a Claremont thing, and that was such the innovation that he brought of being able to inject the soap opera plots. And when I heard your description of the animated film bios listing the powers last, I thought that's straight Claremont.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, watching the movie last night and watching Days of Future Past last night, it was I was struck by how it's very X-Men in that all of the characters are in conflict with each other.
Mm-hmm.
It's Xavier versus Magneto. It's Wolverine on this side and Mystique on this side, and they all have very specific points of view. They're all very specific characters. And they're at odds with each other frequently, which is something that you don't see in a lot of movies, particularly superhero movies. Because I was thinking while I was watching it of the Avengers movies, where there's bickering and there's banter and things like that, but basically they all get along, and they fight a very specifically evil villain for the most part.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a little more one note, and I think for that reason, I think that's always been one of the things that has made X-Men a little more interesting, a little more satisfying, is that it's not a typical superhero concept. It's really more of a science fiction idea. Nowadays we'd say it was a mashup with superhero conventions.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's why it has depth. I think that's why it attracted a guy like Claremont, who he never really appeared to me to be terribly interested in straight superhero comics, but X-Men, because it had all of these other sort of resonances on a political level, on a cultural level, on a and how it affects these characters personally. It made it perfectly suited for someone like him.
Mm-hmm.
And it really just sets X-Men apart. I think it's probably the best concept of any of the early Marvel comics, because it has such depth built into it. I mean, maybe Spider-Man. Spider-Man is of course about a single person, but X-Men has so many things you can do with it that are harder to do with more straight superhero characters. Because for the Avengers, a lot of those characters, they're classic heroes, which is fine, but they don't, they're not. A lot of them are choosing their path. A lot of them are deciding that they want to be this type of person, and
Mm-hmm.
the X-Men are not. So you get kind of a broader mix of people and of personality types, and I think it's just a deeper mix, and Claremont was able to sort of see that and bring that to the X-Men, and he deserves a lot of credit. I think I even remember, boy, 20 years ago, I read an interview in, I think of all places, Wizard magazine with Howard Chaykin, and Howard was saying that basically every superhero comic book writer owed a debt to Chris Claremont, because everyone was doing Claremont,
Mm-hmm.
and they're still basically all writing in Claremont style. you look at the stuff that was being done in the 70s. Everybody was trying to be Stan Lee. You get to the 80s, everyone was trying to be Claremont and maybe a little bit of Alan Moore, and more Alan Moore as it came along. But Claremont was you could tell. I could tell when I picked up a book, even if I didn't look at the credits, that Claremont was writing it, because there was a certain, well, not just a style to his prose, but just a certain seriousness, a certain thoughtfulness to it. He was putting things in the text that you couldn't get from the images, but they still added to the story, which I think is something that the more cinematic approach to comics we have today kind of leaves out a little bit.
Yeah, and he was also playing around with history, like with Magneto's past, and also with some literary devices that, it's interesting. I mean, you mentioned Alan Moore, and a lot of people have pointed out that, especially Captain Britain and to a lesser extent, some of the Warrior work, Alan Moore definitely went through his sort of Chris Claremont sort of pastiche phase as he was developing. And it's interesting to me that, I think the debt you describe that comics owe to Claremont is pretty great, but that Claremont's not usually mentioned in the same kind of pantheon of great comics writers, which may be an injustice.
I think it'll eventually be corrected, but yeah, I mean, Chris wrote the #1 selling not just one book, but like 3 or 4 books for years and years and years. He's got a big target on his back, and that's kind of just a natural part of any sort of human group. I think is the person who's that successful, everyone sort of wants to take a pot shot at. But I think the quality of the work stands up. Whenever I look back at his old X-Men stuff, they're a lot more vivid to me than most of the other comics of the time, and maybe it's just because I've read them so many times. But they still stand out to me as having a little bit more in them than a lot of the other stuff of the time.
Well, and one of the things that Claremont brought, and you discuss this in your book, especially as it pertains to his development of Magneto, that you were talking about how most of the Marvel movies are really just a big bad, and most of the Marvel movies, I mean, their motivation for the villain is just, I'm Loki, I want to blow things up, right?
Right.
And Magneto, under Claremont, really developed away from the sort of Stan Lee Brotherhood of Evil Mutants into somebody who really had a vision for the world and who saw himself as a good guy. And that brings a kind of nuance and moral ambiguity at its best that you see in the films that seems directly from Claremont.
Yeah. I mean, Chris's bringing in the Holocaust imagery into X-Men was a huge idea. I mean, I think it was very important because it brought in it reflected all of the themes that are inherent in the book, but it also, it's real, and it's one of the scariest, real things that has happened in recent history, and it was extremely powerful imagery to tap into. And to use, and I know I responded to it quite a bit, but yeah, I mean, it's I think Chris always had he never really set out to be a comic book creator. I think he wanted to be a writer, he wanted to be an actor, he wanted to be all these other things, and I think he sort of tried to put everything he did on into a cultural level where he wanted people to read X-Men, but also read whatever the best-selling book of the day was, to watch read the New York Times. He wanted intelligent people to sort of have be able to get something out of X-Men as well, and I think that also I mean, it made it interesting for him, I'm sure, because he obviously is interested in history, and it works so well in X-Men. It doesn't work quite so well in some of the other comic books, but in X-Men it works extremely well, and adds a bit of depth to it, and it adds just a bit of credibility and groundedness that that is very rare for a superhero comic, especially one that's been around now for 50+ years. You know.
Stuart, did we have any questions?
Yes, we do have a couple questions. Actually, one in particular looks really good that I thought you guys might like to answer. So this question says, some say that X-Men began as an allegory to the paranoia of the McCarthy era, and as the series evolved, it began to address other issues like race, gender equality, and now LGBTQ issues that Singer would be addressing primarily in his movies. Do you think that X-Men might run out of issues to talk about? Because it seems like we're approaching this exponential curve and gradient of available issues to talk about, and I mean, I just can't imagine like a future where someone's writing about like the plight of the Guatemalans or something like that, or some kind of or like, you know.
Okay.
So,
well,
yeah.
that's a good question. Actually, I don't think I think the X-Men the concept and the idea of the mutants is non-specific enough that you can apply it to pretty much anything you want. And I think all you have to do is sort of look at the news, the news today to see that race is still a huge issue, religion is a huge issue, politics is a huge issue. People are always going to find reasons to disagree with each other, to ostracize each other, to act in the way that in ways that you can put into X-Men. What's the challenge is whether or not Marvel or Disney, who owns Marvel, or Fox, who does the movies, have the courage to really push that relevance into the current material the way that with the impact that, as we were talking about, the Holocaust imagery had with Claremont. I think you really could do some great stuff with X-Men these days, using race, using religion, using a lot of other ideas. I think what you got, they do sort of have to move on from the idea that it's just sort of a, I think we've had a long stretch where it's been seen as an allegory for homosexuality, for coming out as gay, and certainly Bryan Singer played a lot into that. But the way I see it, the way society has changed, where gay marriage is now largely, it's on its way to full acceptance in this country. There's a lot of countries where it's been passed. I think basing it on that specific experience is losing some of its power, because it's not as ostracizing as it was 20, 30, 40 years ago. But I think they can. There's certainly plenty of opportunities there to inject that kind of realism into X-Men and to make it relevant for today. It's just now that it's so completely corporately controlled, you have to wonder if they're going to be able, if anyone would be allowed to do that with this property.
So, Tom, would you like to see? Would you like to see a story in which Nightcrawler is unarmed and shot by a cop? I'm serious. I mean, I think that's a real issue, and you can use the X-Men to explore that. I mean, I'm joking that it has to be Nightcrawler, but I mean, it's a real issue.
It's a real issue. I mean, maybe not exactly that story, but I mean, I think that is exactly the sort of thing you could put into it. I mean, I've always thought that the missed opportunity, the thing that the X-Men has sort of always been promising since the first issue, is this eventual huge all-out war between the humans and the mutants, and I think that would be a direction to go in for the comics that would be really interesting and could provide some interesting sparks.
If they're not too scared of publishing because they don't get all of the money.
That's the issue. Is just I mean how edgy are they going to let it be these days? Because for a long time Marvel was you know, comics were not watched very closely. There was, X-Men came about because Claremont could kind of do what he wanted without anybody really saying no for a long time, and I don't think that environment exists these days for a Marvel comic or a DC comic. I mean, you can, you'd have to create something new and do it through Image or another publisher that would have, give you the freedom to do that. But you never know. Every once in a while, someone at these corporations can surprise you a little bit, and we'll see something fun.
By the way, it's that very idea of the sort of promise of the all-out war to come that is why I like Last Stand. Because it doesn't have the budget to really go there, but it at least, like you said, tries to. You feel as if, oh wow, it's really happening. This is what we were building up to. And I think that's cool to kind of follow through on your threats, as a story.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm interested in actually from hearing from you, Tom, about with the Apocalypse story. Like, where do you think they're going to go with that one? Because Apocalypse is, because it seems it's kind of interesting, because in Last Stand, or no, not Last Stand, in First Class, they're embedding this historical character into these historical characters in this actual time period of like the 50s and 60s and 70s and everything. But then you have Apocalypse, who is, as old as can be. He's from ancient Egypt and everything. And I think what the success of a lot of of these new reboot films is that they're very believable, they're very credible, and you can really kind of imagine this alternate U.S. history. With Apocalypse, it might be too fantastic, or it might be too kind of outlandish. So I was kind of curious to see if the comics sort of supports, he's a mutant, so he lives forever kind of aspect to the story, and if that would support sort of like the historicity of this new reboot, and how that sort of gives a lot of the lifeblood to this new reboot series.
Right. Well, I mean, I don't really know. I know almost nothing about what they're doing on the next movie. I'm interested to see. I think it is a character who, I mean, he didn't come along until the mid '80s, so he and his backstory is he's been around the whole time. He's just working behind the scenes and doing things like that. So I think it's possible to sort of bring him in and bring in a character like that still into the continuity, especially since at the end of the last end of Days of Future Past, they've kind of rebooted everything. So it's a bit of a fresh start for them. They can do kind of whatever they want, and at this point, even who knows if even First Class took place. I mean, anything can happen. So I mean, we'll see. I mean, I think the character has some good potential. The way he sort of appears in the comic is going to be difficult, I think, to translate into something that's going to work on screen, because he has such a comic booky design to him. But I think his overall, the overall idea of him as someone who's going to, challenge the mutants and challenge humanity to evolve by being the strongest is something that you can pretty easily make into a movie, and that'll be fun. And I mean, who knows what they'll do with the four horsemen too. I mean, maybe they'll I guess Angel is going to be in the movie. Maybe they'll turn him into Death, like they did in X Factor all those years ago. Who knows? It'll be fun. I guess we got about a year to wait before we can go see that.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to. In fact, actually, one of the things I liked most about the idea of introducing Apocalypse is now we have another Darkseid doppelganger on-screen cinema, and another character for comic book fanatics to go, oh, cool, they're doing Darkseid before DC can do Darkseid. So when Darkseid actually happens, everyone's going to be like, oh, they're just, DC's just, riffing off of Marvel and all these things. It's like, no.
Yeah.
Haven't you read The Fourth World? Jack Kirby did that like 10 years before everyone else did.
It's so strange because like when I was when I was a kid and I was really into X-Men, nobody knew, except the other people at the comic shop, knew who they were, what any of this was about. Now I go to the grocery store and they're on magazine covers, and the lady at the checkout stand is saying, "Oh, have you seen the X-Men movie?" And I didn't like the last one, but this one looks really good. And it's such a completely different world now.
It is surreal.
It is surreal because I mean I never would have thought that we would have this much content. This many Marvel movies, this many DC movies, this many comic book movies, and the biggest danger I think is that the studios seem very determined to test the limits of people's appetite for this. And with 10 Marvel movies and 10 DC movies, and then more X-Men, more Spider-Man, more Fantastic Four, and then whatever independent stuff they make, and all the stuff on TV, something's going to flop.
Yeah. Yeah.
Marvel's been lucky to have this pretty good run so far, but in making 10 movies in the next 5 years, something's going to be even relatively a flop. And it's more challenging for DC because they haven't had as many hits outside of Superman or Batman yet.
Right, and no trend lasts forever.
Yeah.
I was going to ask, is there another question, Stuart?
Actually, let's see here. Got my notepad up here. Oh yeah, here's a question. So in Wolverine, or in the latest Wolverine movie, there's this historical depiction of Hiroshima or Nagasaki rather. It's a historical depiction of Nagasaki blowing up in the distance and everything. As far as basing Wolverine in this Japanese culture, sorry, this question's kind of weird.
Do you know the question?
Yeah, sorry. I'm
Major Tom to control room.
let's skip over that one. Okay, yeah, here we go. So with Gamergate and with ComicGate, these huge issues dealing with comics being more diversified, more sensitive to feminism and gender issues and equality issues, why don't you think people have really jumped on X-Men for approaching these issues as opposed to all these other comics where this has been sort of just like a side thing that they occasionally reach out to and try to address? Like, do you envision with X-Men's publishing history being sort of prone to being accused of being these placement for social justice warriors or something like that, or if you could even diffuse a lot of the comic gates and a lot of these gender conspiracies by just pointing to X-Men and going like, well, you're talking about comics being more progressive.
Right.
X-Men's been doing this for the last 30 years and no one seems to have much of a problem with it. So
right.
Kind of what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think X-Men is a good example of the right way to do this sort of thing. And again, it goes back to Claremont having created and maybe like characters like Storm he didn't create, but he essentially defined the character. Under him there were points where there were more female characters than male characters in the X-Men. You could have called the book X-Women. And they're good characters. They're ones that people like. I'm not sure why it's not referred to more. Maybe it's just because the general emphasis from Marvel seems to be more on the Avengers stuff these days, and the X-Men stuff is I don't know. It seems like the X-Men is not the cool corner of the Marvel universe these days. Everyone's more into the Avengers. Everyone's more into Captain America and Iron Man, who years ago when the X-Men were on top, those were the also-rans. These are all, I think, cyclical things, but X-Men should be cited and put into these conversations because it has been doing exactly the sort of thing for a long time. And I think when you look at a lot of, I look at a lot of the people who are writing and commenting on this stuff. A lot of times they do when they want to talk about something positive or something that inspired them to get into comics. It's a character like Rogue, or it's a character like Storm. It's something from the X-Men. And it should be put out there more as an example. I think it's been a good example of that. I mean, it can always do better, but it's been compared to everything else in superheroes, which is mostly white guys. It's way out in front there.
Okay. So we're about actually at the end of our time here. Julian, do you have any concluding thoughts or any concluding questions that you might have for Tom?
Well, I've got a lot of questions. I'm disappointed we didn't get to talk about Wrath of Khan, which I know is a favorite of both of ours.
I love Wrath of Khan.
I do too. It's a brilliant movie, even outside of its science fiction milieu. But I wanted to point out that the same thing that made you weird at Variety or gave you the extra superpower of knowing comics and also being, within that Venn diagram, within the Hollywood scene, is what made you the perfect person to write this book. And I just think it's such a brilliant book, and the fact that you not only know the X-Men inside and out, but are such a clear writer and come from Hollywood where you actually talk to so many of the creators and writers and people involved in these movies. What a unique opportunity, and what a perfect person to write this book, and a gentleman to boot. So I just want to thank you, Tom, and tell you how much I love this book, and encourage everybody to go out and read it, because no matter how much you think you know the X-Men, you don't know it like Tom knows it.
Right. and these movies, The Last Stand came out almost 10 years ago, so there's a lot of people who might maybe haven't seen or were into these movies as much as nowadays as people were when they came out, and it's something to go back and you can re-examine with either fresh eyes or with new eyes if you haven't seen them yet. But
well, thank you so much. Thank you to our patrons. We really support it. We really appreciate what you do for us, and it means the world to us. We never go through a day without thinking of your kindness, and that's really true. You make Sequart possible. And so thank you so much to Stuart and to Tom, and we'll see you again next month.
Great.
All right.
Thanks, everyone.
Cool.
Thanks.